Welcome to Remember Me by Intervivos, the show about living life to its fullest, leaving a legacy, and deciding how you will be remembered. And now, your humble team of expert planners taking the legal world by storm.
Hey everybody, this is Glen Wagstaff with Intervivos, managing partner and attorney, and just here in the studio with Mike Black. And we're starting brand new, Remember Me as a show, basically, to talk about leaving a legacy and what you do during life to be remembered after you're gone. So, Mike, as this is our first show, I kind of wanted to take a moment and explain a little bit of why do you think people are so moved or motivated by listening to stories? As I think just as humans, stories move us. Why is that something that you think affects people?
Well, sometimes I think that when we hear stories, we think, wow, this is what they did, but also, wow, could that happen to me? And what would I do in that situation? So I'm thinking that people look at that and want to figure out what would be best for them, or, what would they do in that situation as well.
So I've been a big history buff ever since I was in middle school. And, one of the things that I've always thought is that the most interesting parts of history are hearing the stories of these famous individuals, people who made a difference while they were alive. And that's really kind of one of the things we wanted to convey was while we're here on Earth, it's our opportunity to leave a mark. And sometimes it's something that's really easy for us to see the effects of while we're alive. Sometimes we don't see it until after we're gone. And so one of the things we really kind of want to explore is talking about some of these stories of people who have come and left, and what did they do during life, and what happened after they died, and then what kind of a legacy have they left since. And then, we'll have guest speakers on and talk about strategies and how, everyday people like us can be able to do that type of thing on our own as well and be able to leave a legacy to our posterity and to those that we care about. But today, we kind of wanted to jump into one of these stories from somebody in history. I was actually coming back from Southern California. I was, on a trip down there, and on the flight there was, because Martin Luther King Jr. Day, they had the Selma movie on, right? And so I was kind of watching part of that, and it got me thinking about just MLK's legacy, what he did, while he was here, on Earth and while he was alive. Of course, nowadays, race relations are still a very important topic that we deal with on a daily basis. But I just remember, as Martin Luther King talked about having a dream that one day everybody would be able to live in harmony, and I just don't know that we've gotten there yet. But yeah, for sure. Yeah,
we haven't gotten there yet.
but it's so interesting that his legacy has really changed the outlook that most of us have in society, and really how race relations are approached, and everything in regards to how our political structure and approaches are. It's just interesting to me that one person can have that big of a difference. So I wanted to explore a little bit, about his life and what kind of a legacy he left. And of course, it's an interesting story about his estate. He actually passed away without an estate plan, so we'll get into that a little bit as well. So when do you remember the first time that you learned about Martin Luther King, or because I learned about him in elementary school, right? You're a little bit older than I am.
Yeah, I'm a little bit older, and I actually lived through a lot of it because 1964, it was starting to come out. My mom was born and raised down in the South, so she lived through a lot of that as well. And I heard this, and it was when I was really young, and I was living through the 60s. And going through the 70s, and everything was trying to, it was a big topic. And,
so, sitting down with older clients and people who remember those times, some of the memorable events that happened, marches on Washington and famous speeches and so on that people actually were alive for, they remember, these are some of the things that are actually, now threads of our, history as a country, right? I just think it's really interesting to have been around during that time. What are some of the things? Is there anything that stands out in particular of anything that you remember about race relations or about Martin Luther King and some of the marches or anything that you remember growing up?
Yeah, I do remember one time. I think his name was Hubert Humphreys. He's the governor of Alabama. He got shot, and he was in with the race relations, doing the busing kids over, trying to integrate the schools. And I was just a kid. I was really young. I think I was around 10, 8, 9, 10, around this time. And just, it impacted me because I didn't know what was going on. My parents didn't ever talk about those kinds of things, but, it was something that I was trying to figure out for myself. Why is all this going on? Why can't people just get along? This kind of thing as I was thinking. I mean, I remember when I was in school, there was one little boy, his little black boy. His name was Cameron. And nobody talked to him, and I did. And because my last name was Black, I got a lot of kids teasing me because of my name. They called me all sorts of names, and I felt for Cameron. I thought, he's a good kid. I wanted to make friends with people, and I didn't care what color they were.
It's interesting growing up in Southern California, and primarily with a Latino community and having a Latino background myself. It's interesting growing up and just not really having a sense of what things were like when the segregated South and so on and so forth, because of course down there in Southern California, completely different environment, right? And different perspective on everything. And of course, it was after all of these types of movements. But growing up, throughout elementary school and middle school and then into college, there's a story and that we're told of how things went. And a lot of times, if we don't explore the story further on our own, we don't get a lot of the details. Right. But the thing that's really interesting, I wanted to explore more is, Dr. Martin Luther King probably had no idea during his lifetime what kind of effect he would have on the fabric of society. And evidence of that is part of what we want to explore as we talk about it as a state, because a lot of just the speeches and just the regular everyday things that he touched now have a lot of value.
Absolutely.
People go to museums to see this type of thing and to be able to just kind of get a glimpse of this is where the King family lived. And this is where he was assassinated. This is this was the speech that he delivered, right? And this is and then a lot of those specific items that are just everyday things that we would never consider as having value other than sentimental value.
Right.
Of course, when you're in a position like him as a leader of the type of movement that he led at the time, there's a lot of passion behind that type of thing, and so there's some value there, obviously, but real value, tangible value of money value, sometimes we overlook because we're not famous yet, right?
Right.
But during life, those are the things that, and it's the same thing that we find after somebody passes away. Most of the fights that happen aren't over the money; it's actually over those sentimental items, right? And so, during Dr. King's life, one of the things that was interesting was he didn't accumulate a lot of assets.
In fact, he gave a lot of it away, didn't he?
Yeah, because his life was dedicated towards a cause, right? He lived for a reason, and pretty much everything he did was to further that purpose, right? And which is why I think one of the reasons why he's been remembered so much is because of that passion that was surrounding that cause. But a lot of the value in his estate ended up being those day-to-day items, copies of speeches and items that were just his personal belongings and those things that had sentimental value and possibly for the family, but then take on value as everybody else who's heard the story want to now see those items in museums and so on.
And they want to take part of history, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're taking part of history. Every single one of us is taking part of history as we live, right? And I guess the point I was trying to make is we don't know, what we touch, what value it's going to have for our posterity and for the future, and And we'll definitely want to kind of explore a little bit of what happened, with all of this and with his estate and with his family. But I just think it's a perfect kind of case study for, living life and not realizing how much value we have until we're gone.
Yes.
Right? So we're going to take a break here. Thanks for joining us, of course, on the Loving Liberty Radio Network and K-Talk. We're talking about Dr. Martin Luther King, and we'll be back after the break.
Hey, just for the sake of those listeners just tuning in, though, who are saying, who is this charming young man, and who is this distinguished gentleman he's talking to? Maybe give them your name one more time just so they know who you are.
Yeah, Glen Wagstaff with Intervivos, attorney managing partner. I'm here with Mike Black.
That's me.
And this show is called?
Remember Me.
Very good. This is the inaugural show. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome back to Remember Me, the show about leaving a legacy, being remembered, and strategies on how to do that. We're talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and before the break, we were just talking about, how in everyday life, there's so many things that we touch that we don't even consider that it could have value at some point in the future. And Dr. King didn't have a big estate by any means, not a lot of value in his estate other than those everyday items that were then left. And interestingly enough, his personal Bible was one of those things that has actually been used in the inaugural swearing in ceremonies for the President of the United States. And of course, it's one of the traveling Bibles that probably goes to multiple museums throughout the country. One of the things that I wanted to get into was, what happened when Dr. King passed away with his estate. Somebody who, lived his life really by the creed of bringing people together. When he passed away, there's no way that he would have wanted battles between the family or between, interested people with the items that he left behind or with his estate. And unfortunately, that's part of what happened. That's exactly what happened.
He's got child against child, and that's really, I think he'd be rolling over in his grave if he saw what was going on with his kids. And it never ceases to amaze me how they're, one's trying to keep the legacy alive on the nonprofit side, the other one's trying to make money on it. And I think he would have a fit. I really think he would be struggling with what's going on.
So Dr. King, during his life, he never really left an estate plan, didn't do a will, and there wasn't, from most people's perspective, there wasn't a lot of value or reason to do that, other than what happened after he passed away was that a lot of these everyday things, had value, and so everything was left to his wife, and while she was around, that seems like a pretty natural transition. But then the interesting thing is that a lot of the conflict came up because they had given gifts to family friends, people that they knew, people who were part of the movement, and those gifts were then later contested by the family because now there's dollars attached to them.
Right. I was reading about Harry Belafonte where he was given some documents, and he was trying to.
I think it was a speech, a written speech that Dr. King had given, and
and a letter that LBJ gave to Mrs. King, Coretta, and he was trying to put them on auction. I don't know what he was auctioning them for. Maybe it was just to go into a museum or something. But the estate contested it because they weren't getting anything off of it, and this was a gift he was given because he was a close friend and confidant of Dr. King.
When somebody passes away, and whether they're famous or not, it's hard on the family. And there was young children left, right, and they grow up sometimes without life insurance proceeds or anything like that to care for them. So maybe there's some understanding of why the family would want to get the value out of these items because really it's the only legacy of money that was left.
Right.
But at the same time, there's something to be said about the general public and people who were there, who were in the trenches with Dr. King, who often were part of these speeches and so on. And it was given as a gift to a friend during his life. And then later, all of a sudden, there's a court battle trying to bring it back into the estate, and basically because there's dollars attached to it.
That's interesting, because I was reading this about Andrew Jackson Young, who was in the trenches with Dr. King. And he said, the kids were saying, well, this is our stuff, this is our history. He says, well, it's my history too, because he was right there, elbow to elbow with Dr. King. So he's got every right as well, to be part of that.
And maybe even more so, right? None of us can really relate to the experience of somebody who was actually there in person.
Absolutely.
But interestingly, there was not too long ago, I don't remember what year it was, but there was a commercial that ran that was during the Super Bowl game.
2018, 50th anniversary.
Yeah, and it caused a little bit of an uproar. And part of it was because, they were saying that, Ram was using the memory of Dr. King and, some of his, images and so on to be able to sell these trucks, and that was inappropriate. But come to find out, the family was behind it because...
Exactly. They had to open the way for them to get there. And in that speech that they used, I was reading about it, and he actually talked bad about those things, being flashy and showy, buying Cadillacs and things like that. He was not for that at all. So the family going and letting the auto dealers do that. It's really interesting. Not what he would have done.
Well, there's the public memory, right, yes. and the legend really that springs up with some of these people that have lived, in history and become part of our history. That as a public, that we don't want to see that memory affected tarnished or marred. But there's got to be, there's some right probably that the family has in deciding what that legacy that's perpetuated is. And again, when there's dollars attached to it, there's more interest there.
Absolutely.
So, I think it's interesting mainly because there is this kind of tug of war between, how the family is willing to allow, Dr. King to be remembered, and how the rest of society, the rest of the public would like to see him remembered.
Well, I think that's interesting, because the tug of war, because it's one side of the family wants to keep it a nonprofit kind of thing, and the other side of the family wants to make money off it. Like you said, is because they were left penniless. They didn't have anything. He didn't have an estate plan. But the memory and the legacy that he's trying to leave, what would he really want? He would want his kids to be taken care of. That's for sure. He would have wanted them to be taken care of. But what does he want to be left, and what does he
and at what cost?
Yes,
and at what cost? Because I think anybody would say that passion for the movement and for really getting to a point of equality on all levels was first and foremost, right? And a lot of times our ancestors sacrificed so much for what they believe in, only to see their posterity not believe in those same things, right? Yes. Or not as strongly. And maybe the fiercest part of this tug of war was actually in a lawsuit against one of the king's family members. I think it was a sister or a cousin.
Bernice, yes, it was.
Who set up a museum basically at their old residence, right, with a few of the items,
right, to
be able to display for the public, no cost, right, nonprofit sort of basis, and then the family again contesting that because instead they could sell those items, or they could have payment received for having them travel to different museums and so on. Interesting, a lot of times we overlook what kind of legacy we're leaving simply because we don't think we have enough assets or property of value to worry about it. But every person that comes and lives on Earth, they leave a mark. Sometimes that mark is bigger, sometimes it's smaller. But the thing that we really need to consider is what kind of values are we leaving behind as a legacy, rather than what kind of items or money are we leaving behind. So just, as we kind of wrap things up, how do you think, just in general, that the legacy that Dr. King has left of how he's been remembered by the history books and also by the public, do you think that it's what he would have wanted?
I think for the most part, the history books remember him correctly, because he was a man of great ethics, high ethics. He did want the equality, and he wanted to be like me. Everybody colorblind. Doesn't matter what color the skin they have. It doesn't matter. It's their character. And I think history remembers him that way for the most part that I see. And with these things coming up with the family, it kind of tarnishes how he is remembered. And
sometimes there's larger than life. There's larger than life personas, mm-hmm. right? That we harken back to Ronald Reagan, Dr. Martin Luther King, a lot of these people who have kind of gone through history and left a big enough mark that they don't just represent, their life. They represent something bigger than themselves.
A movement, yes.
And for those of us who want to leave a legacy, consider the sentimental things that you're leaving behind, the items and so on, how the family's going to treat that. But consider also, what kind of a legacy of values are you living? What are you living your life for? And do the people that you care about the most understand that? And that's something that, as we approach planning, that we always kind of look at. But I think there's a lesson here that we can definitely learn from Dr. King and his estate, and really from the legacy that he's left. So, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, or in memory of that day on Monday, glad that we could kind of dig into this. And we'll be exploring more of these stories, more famous stories of celebrities and so on, and having some guest speakers. And I think next week we have a guest speaker on with us. So thanks for joining us, and continue to come in with Remember Me. We're excited to